2013. Rose, could you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Boger,
Here.
Councilmember Greenlee,
Here.
Councilmember Plinsky, Councilmember Shoemaker, Councilmember Shoemaker,
Here.
Councilmember McDaniel,
Here.
Councilmember Freeman, Councilmember Lindsay.
Here.
Council members Plinsky and Freeman let us know that they likely would not be in the meeting this evening. Are there any members of the public that would like to comment to council before we get started in our workshop? Okay, seeing none yet, we will go on to new business, our utility cost of service presentation. Trevor.
Great. I'd like to introduce Karen Johnson with FCS Group. Karen's been helping us since 2007. She's been in the utility rate and cost of service financial planning industry for 28 years, 20 I believe with FCS, 25-year anniversary for FCS Group in this specific field. With that, I'd like to turn it over and get started. Got a fairly full agenda tonight.
Okay.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. So I think I've met most of you, other than a couple of you I haven't worked with in the past, so thank you for having me here. I think the first thing that I wanted to do is just give a brief introduction about FCS Group, just for the benefit of those who haven't worked with us in the past. Recap what the work has been done to date on the water and sewer rates, an overview of the current rate study process, and then kind of requesting any input or direction for us to get going on looking at the alternative rate structures that we might be proposing for water and sewer. And then just going over preliminary schedule timelines of when we expect to come back again. So FCS Group has been serving municipalities in the water and sewer, electric, transportation industries for about, well, I could say 25 years is our anniversary. We're experts in the financial rate utility planning side of things. We've performed about 1,500 utility rate studies.
Could we move the microphone
sure.
closer?
Can I just move it? Will it work okay? We have 25 employees in our offices. We've got offices in Redmond, Washington, Portland, Oregon, just opened one in Anchorage, Alaska. And I've been the principal in charge and working on all the rate studies that we've worked for the city to date, so can bring some ability to answer some questions on any of the past work that's been done. So first, just going over a historical recap of what the previous analysis was done. The main study was done in 2010. The major elements there were we established financial policies. In particular, we looked at introducing infrastructure reinvestment funding into the rates and developed phase-in strategies for that. At the time, we had implemented a 5-year phase-in strategy for the water utility and a 10-year phase-in strategy for sewer. We also proposed revising the historical practice that the city had in using your system development charge revenues to help pay for your annual debt service, to change that policy where you would limit the use of your system development charges just to directly funding for capital. That was kind of a rate mitigation strategy for if growth doesn't occur as planned, you'd still be able to make your debt service payments through rates. We updated the system development charges and revenue needs for the 5-year period based on the current capital planning at the time, and we developed rate adjustment strategies through 2015. We also removed the fire protection costs from the water rates and increased your utility tax to recover that cost in compliance with the Lane versus Seattle Supreme Court ruling from 2008.
Question about the Lane case.
Sure.
Was that change 10% to 20.4%? Was that revenue neutral? Was that?
Yes, it's revenue neutral. What is the general fund makes a payment to the water utility to cover fire, and then the water utility passed that through back to the general fund. Then after that study was completed, there was some subsequent analysis done both by city staff and FCS Group's involvement on that, where the capital plans were adjusted to try to spread some of those costs over a longer period of time. There were some projects pending DOE approval for delays. We also re-looked at the time phasing of the reinvestment funding strategy for water and moved that out from 5 years to 10 years, more consistent with water, to try to mitigate those rate increases there. The result of that change was the proposed changes for 2015 decreased from the 13% proposed down to 3%, And for sewer, 2013 decreased from 26.5 to 13, and then from 11 to 10 in 2014, and 11 to 8 in 2015. And then also city staff looked at your discount policy for your low-income seniors and brought forth a change to the threshold and the level of your discount eligibility for that. So that's what's been done to date. I don't know if you have anything to add on the historical before I move on to current study.
Yeah, the pending DOE approval specifically is the secondary clarifier for the mechanical plant expansion, the wastewater treatment plant. That's what we have.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
The secondary clarifier at the wastewater treatment plant as far as the mechanical expansion.
That's,
That was pending approval at that time.
and that's been approved to postpone that now?
Yes.
Thank you.
So just quickly here on this one, this is a recap of what was proposed before and what was the change here. So again, we initially had some increases in 2011 and 12 and 13, and the circled one on the end is the one that had changed, again, decreasing to 3%. Again, from the historical analysis, the major cost drivers in that current period's rate adjustments were the elimination of the SDCs paying debt service, the new debt service needed to fund the capital program, and then the system reinvestment funding policy. And then again, just looking at those results for sewer, same kind of major drivers. With the exception on sewer, there was also a drawdown of the reserves from historically using the reserves to help supplement the expenditure. So rebuilding those reserves in addition to the additional cost estimates. And then again, just the last 3 years were revised with the subsequent
This is a
analysis.
strategy, right? It's not an absolute.
This was
requirement.
this was a strategy during the 2010 rate study, and so they were adopted at the
Okay.
time, and then the changes noted up above were revised
Okay.
subsequent to that.
And revised to what?
So, for example, if you look on the water rate adjustment strategy, it was 13% for 2005, 15, excuse me, and then that's dropped down to 3%.
Okay.
And then for sewer, there was the 3 years there at the end of 26.5, 11, and 11, and those were dropped down to 13, 10, and 8.
Okay.
Council adopted those adjustments.
Before I was on?
No,
Oh,
no, that happened as we transitioned into the 2013 rates. You'll recall that.
that
we
was
brought
part of the.
Yes.
Okay, plus the $500,000.
So this is just demonstrating the interim step that's been taken.
Okay. One of the questions I have, it says elimination of use of SDCs to pay debt service. Was that because we weren't getting any SDCs? We were, what was the reasoning behind that?
I think we received a recommendation around industry best practice. I could let Karen elaborate on that.
Generally, what was happening with the slowdown in growth is utilities had their SDCs helping to pay for the debt service. Legally, you can use those revenues to directly pay your capital or your debt service, and the debt service is the obligation plus meeting your coverage and all of that. And so if that was coming from the SDCs, and growth was starting to significantly slow in all areas, and a lot of utilities were finding themselves needing to do immediate large rate increases in order to pay that debt service and meet the coverage.
Pretty volatile
Pretty volatile.
revenue stream source too.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, the bond underwriters, bond counsel made a very, very strong case that we needed to, if we were going to go out for revenue bonds, that we had to have the revenue to support it, and that SDCs, as you say, are so variable that they really don't contribute to, and there was close to 0.5% difference in the bond rating.
Yeah, well, the city would probably have to backstop it anyway if the SDC revenue fell short. Go on. I have some more questions about SDCs.
Sure.
A question. Am I correct in assuming that the use of cash reserves comes from the utility enterprise fund?
Yes, it does. It's
Okay.
yes, within each utility.
Thank you.
Yes. And so the strategy involved, we established minimum levels to keep in the funds, and then anything that was above that, we used to help smooth the rate increases over time. So not proposing having them drop down below kind of industry best practices. So then just touching on what we'll be doing in the current update is we're going to be evaluating alternative replacement funding phase and strategy. So again, revisiting whether that expenditure should be phased in over 5 years or 10 years or even 20 years to balance out what the level of rate increases are versus what kind of cash you'll have available to pay for capital expenditures to make sure that the debt needs don't get too high. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be bringing forth scenarios for your consideration on that one, probably a couple of alternative scenarios to look at there. We'll also be updating the system development charges to make sure we have the current estimate of what type of capital needs we're looking at and what the capacity is that those projects will be able to serve. We'll validate the 2014 through 15, that's the last half of the previous rate study period. We'll validate the increases that are currently adopted for those years and or adjust as necessary based on the current analysis. And then the two steps that we didn't perform in the last study was the cost of service analysis and the rate structure evaluation. So we're kind of looking at that as phase 2. So we're updating the phase 1 rate analysis and then incorporating phase 2, which is looking at the cost of service for each different customer class, how that should be equitably shared between the classes of the customers, and then looking at your water and sewer rate structures and seeing if there are any potential changes there to better meet your current policies. And then lastly, we will be looking to unwind the removal of the fire protection costs from water rates that we did in the previous analysis, and that is due to the new substitute House Bill 1512, which reverses what we did from the Lane ruling. So there's that, and that becomes effective July 28th. So that's just new information.
Is there a need to do that? We just live with the current. We get. Are we going? Is there a plan to go back to the way it was?
We believe that that is the preferable approach, and and I think that's universally accepted as the preferable approach, as evidenced by the consortium that was advocating for this change. It allows that cost just to be in real time captured as part of the cost of providing water to your community, no matter what that water is used for. The way that we're doing it, there's this loop around that you have to do with your true-ups with the general fund to make sure that you're capturing that cost and then going back and figuring out how much to send over as opposed to just having it in real time.
And the accounting issue is more straightforward.
It's much more straightforward.
So we'll be getting a lower the utility tax ordinance at some point then, because we have to lower the utility tax to.
Correct. I would anticipate that the result of this study will be recommendations for new rate structure alternative or alternatives, and that will necessitate an ordinance that would implement those rate changes, both in the structure and in what the rates themselves are. And that as part of that, there would be a companion ordinance to basically just flip-flop all revenue neutral to all of the funds. Doesn't raise rates. It doesn't change the net impact to a utility customer, but it just flip-flops what we did, right? So that's what I would expect will be in front of you later this fall.
And I will say it was a topic of conversation at the Association of Washington Cities Annual 2 weeks ago, and I can't think of anyone who was doing anything other than putting the water costs back into the utility. I didn't hear anyone have any qualms about that at all.
The only reason I bring it up is it's if we did nothing, it would still be roughly the same. I mean,
It would be exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
It's more efficient for the team
Mm-hmm.
to be able to do it this way, and it makes your tax more precisely correlate in its rate to what you're trying to do in the general fund, as opposed to this thing about trying to cover that other piece of it.
So the only difference from the last time is when we go to do the cost of service analysis, different customer classes have a different fire protection requirement, and so there'll be some cost shifts from the cost of service analysis, but not directly from the change back from the reversing
Okay.
this.
And I just want to say we're very thankful to the legislature for listening to the coalition that brought this, because it's good government, we believe, strongly as cities that it's good government to do it this way as opposed to the other way. And it worked, and it got through, so.
Those Supreme Court justices.
Okay, so then this is just a recap of what the financial policies were that were in the previous study and what we'd be recommending for continuing in this study. And first, there is for each utility, water and sewer, there would be an operating reserve, and that is to provide adequate kind of day-to-day working capital. The recommendation for that, consistent with industry best practice, is to maintain a minimum of about 90 days in the water utility and about 60 days in the sewer utility. The rationale for the difference is the water utility has a slightly higher reserve because it has a lot more volatility in the revenue generation due to the outdoor water usage in the summer. You know, if you have dry versus wet summers, it requires a little bit higher level of reserve. We will be looking at if there are reserves in addition to these minimums that we could use that to help smooth the rate increases over the study period as appropriate. And then looking at capital reserves, which is kind of a similar concept, but for the capital fund. The industry practice is to maintain a capital contingency balance of about 1% to 2% of your fixed assets. And again, that's just to handle unanticipated capital projects, so you're not needing to go out for bonding every time you have an unexpected capital cost. Again, and that is funded through your capital revenues, like your system development charges, and the policy to fund system reinvestment funding from rates. How that policy works is the money comes from the operating fund, gets transferred for use in capital projects, and can help serve as providing funds for that balance, as well as any excess operating reserves can be transferred over there to meet that contingency reserve. So the capital reserve itself doesn't typically have an impact on rates. It's the other policies that kind of are nested along with it, which is the infrastructure replacement funding, the next one shown on there. The purpose of this is to maintain rate stability, to have customer equity between your existing and your future customers, and to just maintain the system integrity by continually replacing your system as it deteriorates. What was proposed last time, and again we'd be bringing forth as the proposal in this study, is to fund an amount annually from rates that's equal to your annual depreciation expense on all of your current assets, net any outstanding debt payments you have on those current assets, and to set that aside to help pay for your capital projects. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we'd be developing some alternative scenarios of just what level of funding to incorporate into the rates.
Karen, how far out have you seen phase-in strategies?
Every year they start over again, so I've seen them go out into infinity. But as far as a policy, 20 years is the longest I've seen anyone do that. But we have found that they have been kind of restarting, so they've a lot of them have not achieved their 100% within the designated time period. The most common is probably 10 years.
And that's where we're at.
Yes, we're currently at. Yeah. 5 years is kind of ideal from the standpoint of having cash. For a lot of utilities, where that ended up with is it just puts a lot of pressure on your rates if you hadn't been funding that all along. And so 10 years is kind of the happy medium of where we see a lot of the utilities
Can it go longer?
Sure.
than 10?
It can go as long as you would like it to go. It's just a matter of then balancing what your capital needs are. The next policy down here, the debt to equity ratio, that's where you're looking to maintain credit worthiness on making sure that you have a prudent balance of cash versus debt financing. The rule of thumb and kind of the bond underwriter's preference is that you have about 50%, no more than 50% debt financing of your capital versus cash financing. And this is where that reinvestment funding plays a key role in that, because that's your only cash resource in addition to the system development charges that come in to pay for that. So those are the things that would be balancing, is if it looks like you're going to need to issue any new debt and that puts pressure on where you would be too high on the debt, then we might want to reconsider maybe doing a little bit shorter
And some of
phase-in
that be made
period.
up for by, because basically we're issuing just revenue bonds on these, we're not issuing any kind of general obligation bonds.
Right, it would be, if there was a need, it would be revenue bonds. And again, where you currently are, and again, we haven't gone into a great deal of the analysis for the current rate study, but I believe you're pretty close to the 50% debt ratio right now. And so it doesn't leave a lot of room for any more debt if you don't get some additional cash infusion in
But
for capital
could we
funding.
trip that 50% level with a city backstop or something like that?
It wouldn't change what kind of the underwriter's industry standard is, 50% debt, 50% equity. I mean, if you have some general fund monies support that, would not be considered equity from a utility
It would be a
enterprise
backstop
fund
of the general
standpoint.
fund, is what it would be.
If you had like
Was
revenue-backed,
Yeah, I know it's
geo-backed
not
revenue
equity,
bonds.
but I'm just saying, sometimes there's a little more flexibility in finances, I learned from.
Right,
Here.
right. You can do the revenue bonds, you can do geo-backed revenue bonds, and you can do straight-out general obligation bonds and still designate the revenue repayment source to be one of the utilities.
Sure.
But again, that changes the capacity of the whole city.
Right.
And so generally speaking, when you're dealing with the enterprise funds, you usually go to like a revenue bond. But those are the three options generally you'd have.
But even if we did that, Karen, you just said that we are already with our current plan at that 50% ratio. The other debt that we would introduce wouldn't come on the equity side in
Right.
the underwriter's calculations. It would be on the debt side. So that really isn't available to us
Right.
unless we could somehow lower our debt.
Right, it's lowering the debt. And, you are paying debt off over time, and so we'll see how that 50/50, shifts over time. If you don't incur new debt, that would significantly shift in your 20-year period after this large bond gets paid off.
So the best way to do that would be to get grants.
That would be perfect if you could get grants.
Or
Yes.
didn't we get $1 million?
We got $1 million, but it was for stormwater improvements, and we're very grateful for that.
But that's built into the rates.
Not the water and sewer rates.
Right, but it's built into what, I'm just looking for ways to mitigate these huge increases that our public has been facing.
Right.
I'll look at anything.
Mhm.
There may be, and, we have to analyze that. What does that $1 million mean to the stormwater rates, which are about $12, $14 every 2 months,
Bi-monthly.
bi-monthly? It's possible that they're,
More like 18 and change,
Okay.
close to 19.
It's possible that will help. We have to analyze that, since that's new information for us. Out of these strategies, the one that we've talked about having potentially the most impact, other than further slowing of the capital plan so that the debt is delayed, is pushing out the phase-in for system reinvestment. And that's why I asked Karen a few moments ago how far she has seen that, and 20 years is the longest you've seen in an adopted policy.
And so, excuse me, I think I would caution that the 20 years probably would not be as workable if you're already at your 50/50 debt.
Is
And
it
you need new
it'll trip the
capital?
ratio up?
So it's really a balance of, we'd have to look at what your additional capital needs are. Where there's a 20-year phase-in policy, where we've seen it's generally that they've had a lot of debt capacity, and so they were able to issue more debt without going past either their coverage requirements or the debt-to-equity ratio. So that's kind of what we'd be looking at. These last three, the replacement funding, the debt-to-equity ratio, and the debt service coverage all kind of work together. And so whatever alternatives we bring, it's balancing that all three of those are working appropriately. Because the one thing that you can't do is default on your debt service coverage requirements. And that kind of leads into,
I've seen it happen before.
not a desired position
Yeah.
for sure. And so that's one of the policy recommendations here, is that the minimum is 1.25. Your revenues less your O&M need to be sufficient to recover the cushion of 25%. And we're recommending that you actually set a higher internal policy to achieve something closer to 1.35 or 1.5 to help mitigate against revenues running short. But again, these three policies all work together, because if you have sufficient system reinvestment funding, it will automatically meet that coverage requirement for you. So they're not incremental, they work together. And so those are what I see the strategies and alternatives that would be brought back, is the impact of those three policies and how, and the balanced with the level of your rates. And we can also look at those combined for water and sewer. While we do look at setting the rates individually and looking at the cost individually between water and sewer, it is a combined utility from a legal standpoint and a bonding standpoint. So the criteria for the debt to equity ratio and the debt service coverage is on a combined water sewer utility basis. Okay, finally, just to kind of recap what is involved in the revenue requirement analysis, that's looking at a multi-year financial plan. We generally look at about 5 years, so we would be looking at 2014 through 2018 for the study update, and it's just determining how much revenue you need to cover your expenditures over that period, including the financial policy impacts, the capital program impacts, and just your general ongoing operating and maintenance costs. It evaluates the sufficiency of the current adopted rates, and then we work to develop a rate implementation strategy to make sure that those costs are met kind of as affordably as possible, and determines how much is recovered for rates, and then that's the foundation that's used to begin the cost of service analysis for the phase 2 portion of the study. What the cost of service does, it provides the rational kind of defensible basis of how you assign cost recovery to the different customer classes you have on your system, single-family residential, multifamily, commercial, and so on, and looking at how those different customer classes use your water and sewer systems differently, and then allocating the cost in proportion to how those customer classes place demands on each of your systems. We look at, do you have an appropriate grouping of classes, or are there some other groups of classes that we need to look at for special circumstances? We do that by evaluating your customer billing data information and your engineering planning documentation, and looking at how your system is designed and what type of uses are placing the impacts on your system. And then it serves as the basis for establishing then what the rate structures are that we would put in place to actually recover and collect those costs. So that's sure.
Excuse me. Can the city be divided into different areas of ratepayers? I was thinking the people up on the hill need the pump station. That's obviously an additional cost to the people that live in the flats that don't have their water pumped. Is that a viable thought?
Location is certainly one of the considerations in setting rates. Generally what you're doing is you want to balance the simplicity with the equity, and there's all kinds of different considerations. There are very few utilities, but there are some that have zone charges for something like that, zone level 1 versus zone level 2 or 3. It's certainly within your authority to charge that. You're just looking to be able to separate out the additional pumping cost or infrastructure cost that just serve that area. So that's a policy kind of a question, if that's an interest. It could be. Okay. Same with doing, you have an outside city multiplier as well for customers that are outside the city limits. They pay a premium on that. Really anything that distinguishes one group from another is a viable rationale for establishing rates. So that could be something that if there's an interest that we could look at that. And again, kind of the key considerations in the rate design that kind of follow just what you were talking about there is you want financial stability and predictability, consistency with underlying costs by customer class, and again, those types of goals would want to be balanced with the complexity of the rates. When you go to something that's more zone-based, it is more complex. And so that's just, again, a balance of what you're looking for is what your rate structure goals are, and what the customer rate impacts are from each of the rate structures that you look at. Generally speaking, affordability is a pretty big concern on the types of the rate structures, so you'd be looking at finding ways to mitigate costs to your low water users, fixed income users, things like that, kind of the social policy aspect of rates. And then looking at the elasticity of demand, probably some of the structures that we would be looking at where it might promote more conservation and more equity by charging different customers on how they use the system could result in a change in use behavior. Having a more aggressive conservation rate structure will likely result in some of your customers at least conserving water, and so we would build that assumption into the rate analysis to try to make sure that you recover enough revenue.
What would you base that on? Do you have other experiences where that's happened, where we switched to an actual theoretically, we are actual use of services if you go over a certain amount, but we have a large amount that, you know, basically up to that amount, we charge everybody the same. Do you have a way to predict how this will change behavior?
We have a way to reasonably predict. Certainly can't predict with certainty, not knowing what everyone's usage patterns would be, but there's a lot of history on how much someone might reduce. There's elasticity, documented elasticity demand factors, which give you a rough idea. Again, you never know how your particular customers will behave, but that we apply that. There's factors, you know, for every 10% of a rate increase, you can expect X percent of a water use reduction, and so we would apply that. And
Is there a chance this might need this change in rate structure might slow our capital needs too, because we won't need to build?
not in a 5-year time period, likely not. The conservation pluses, which are reducing your needs to expand systems and things like that, generally is a little longer term before you would see the impact of that. That's certainly the goal, is to defer capacity.
We get enough rain here, so there's water.
Just got to get it to the house. So those are the things we'll be looking at. We just did an initial water rate structure evaluation. We had some conversations with staff during the last 2010 rate study of what kind of initial things we'd be looking at. So the preliminary evaluation that we had is just looking at your current rate structure and then identifying where maybe some areas of improvement could occur. So your water rate structure right now, there's a fixed charge by meter size that increases with the size of the meter. There's a water usage allowance within each of those meter sizes that also increases with the size of the meter. So for example, your smallest meter size, your 3/4 inch meter, which is a typical residential home, has a usage allowance of 10,000 gallons. And so, so that's one of the things that we're looking at. And then your multifamily is charged on the same schedule, but they're charged the 3/4 inch charge and then a reduced charge per dwelling unit. And then there's a 6-block decreasing structure, because your same schedule of rates applies to all of your customers regardless of class. So it's a decreasing rate structure. The more water you use, the less you pay. That is probably very, very opposite of what the trend has been in the last 10 years, is that the more water you use, the more you pay. And so we'd be looking at proposing that you revise that structure. Again, the same structure applies to all classes, and each different class does use your system considerably different. So we'd be looking at proposing that you establish unique rates for each customer class. So what we're proposing is that you would have a class-specific fixed charge by meter size. So for single family, multifamily, and your commercial, each would have its own schedule of meter charges by meter size. We would propose eliminating the usage allowance. Again, that's consistent with the trends over the last 10 years have been to eliminate usage allowances out of fixed charges and have everyone pay for the actual water that you use. The benefit of that is that, particularly for the fixed income and the low water users, there are customers who don't use that 10,000 gallons, and so we'd be looking at eliminating that and then having a class-specific volume charge unique to each customer class. For single-family residential, this is the area where you can generally find conservation by having a tiered rate structure, maybe 2 to 3 blocks. 3 blocks is pretty common, where you'd have your first block might be something equivalent to a winter water usage, the second block somewhere in between, with the third block really being there to capture that small percentage of your customers that use a lot of your water. And that's where you can generally get your targeted conservation from. Also, by having a tiered structure for single-family residential, you can provide rate relief to your low water users. Because if you charge everyone the same, then everyone pays the average. High water users pay the same as the low water users, and when you move from something like what you have now to a 3-tiered increasing, the benefit will go to the low water user, will be the intent and design of that. That's not to say that all customers won't see an impact. We will need to wait and see what the overall increase needs, but just from a change in structure, the intent and design of eliminating a usage allowance and doing it tiered is to reward or less impact the low water user and to have the high water user paying for that high water use.
One of the problems that was discussed at the Association of Washington Cities was once you go to a conservation system where you significantly reward conservation, then you reduce total water usage, which reduces revenue, which means that you're then in a bind where you have to raise rates again because conservation has been so successful that your rates won't support your system anymore.
It can happen, so
That's
it all.
just what you mentioned a couple minutes ago
Yeah.
when building that cushion in there.
Yeah, so if you design the rate properly, you can mitigate against that by building in that elasticity demand factor. That's one of the things. If you didn't incorporate an assumption that there would be water loss, less water usage, then you likely would not recover enough. But what we'd be doing is building in that you'd need to increase the revenues to cover that. Let's just say that we're going to assume that there's going to be 10% less water. Your rate revenues still have to recover the same costs, and so that gets built into the rates. The other thing that utilities can do is that's why you have that 90-day reserve. And some utilities, if they're going to go to a real aggressive conservation rate, might have 120 days or might even have a separate fund established, a rate stabilization fund for that purposes. So there are a lot of ways to safeguard against it. And so we would be looking at the detailed analysis of your customer billing system stuff so we can see how your customers are currently using water. And then the suggestion is, unless you had a policy directive to do this, the suggestion would not be to move from a declining block rate structure to a very aggressive increasing block rate structure. You might make get it in place, but you don't need the cost differentials to be really steep between them. That helps with it as well. If you have that top block, at $5 and everything else at $1 and you don't get usage in there, you're going to lose probably some revenue. So I would suggest having smaller differentials between them, and then you can adjust that over time. The next 5-year period, if you see it's not working, you can adjust it. So those are all the types of things that we would be looking at. And then instead of the declining block rate structure for your other classes, your multifamily residential and your commercial, they would have a single block volume charge that's particularly designed based on the cost of service allocated to that customer class. And again, we'll have scenarios and we'll have sample customer bills prepared so you can see the impacts of the recommendations. And again, just looking for any feedback today on if there's other things that you'd be interested in, or if this is something that you wouldn't be interested in doing, this kind of a conservation rate structure, then we wouldn't go down that path. And then we're proposing that you'd maintain the outside city multiplier. One last thing in considering for water rates to kind of go in what we just talked about again about safeguarding the loss of the revenue. There are two components of the water rate structure. It's the fixed charges and the volume charges, and it's the balance between that to make sure that you can balance affordability, conservation, with revenue stability for the utility. The fixed charges addresses revenue stability. That's your dollars per meter size, and then the volume addresses more your equity and conservation issues, dollar per unit of water use. Generally, the fixed charges are designed to recover your customer account servicing, billing type costs, meters and services repair. Now with the change in the legislation to where we can recover fire back from the water rates, that's generally recovered from your fixed charge. And then we suggest recovering a portion of your peak demand in the fixed charge. And again, that's to safeguard your revenues, because even if you have, for example, a really wet summer and you don't get a lot of water usage, you still have to pay for your fixed debt service and your fixed O&M. Utilities are really high fixed cost base. Historically, probably 10 years prior, the rule of thumb was to have about 25% of your rate revenue coming from the fixed charge and about 75% from the volume charge. That was the kind of practice when conservation rates were just being introduced. Right now, with probably in the last 5 years, 3 to 5 years, with the economy changes and the experience that utilities have had with not collecting enough revenues because of the conservation, that's kind of shifted more to 30 to 40% from your fixed charge, 60 to 70% from your volume charge, to make sure that that utility can cover its costs. So again, we'd be putting it together for recovering somewhere between 30 to 40%. Again, we have not done the analysis yet, so what I would first start with is what percent are you currently recovering from fixed charges, and then bring forward some options.
I was going to ask you if you knew that.
Yeah, we haven't started the analysis yet, so that would be one of the first things that we would do.
I bet it's the reciprocal of
Well, because you have the usage allowance in there, it will probably be on the higher side. And even though we may need to keep the fixed charge at about the same percentage revenue recovery, it would be by incorporating the fire protection costs in a portion of it, as opposed to having an allowance put in there to where you pay for that whether you use it or not.
Mhm.
And again, these are things that we can bring back. When I first get an initial idea of what the impacts might be, it may be that I would need to bring a couple of alternatives for you to look at, because they'll impact different customers differently. And so, while something might be good for a low water user, it may have a really significant impact on, say, a large commercial customer or something. So we're balancing all of those different impacts to make sure that it's a reasonable structure that kind of mitigates to the best you can of the impacts to all the customers. But when you change from not having done cost of service in certainly over 20 years, there's going to be shifts in customer classes indicated. And so it's whether you can immediately go to that or not. The other thing that we may be recommending is that you phase into it. We can show, this is what the analysis shows, for example, that I think probably where it's looking right now, by looking at the rate structure, is your multifamily and commercial are very likely subsidizing your single family in water. And so that would show a shift from the class as a whole. And so what we'd look to do is take a rate structure then that balances that. If the single family class as a whole needs to go up, how do we balance that between having the low water users not get too hard and have the issue go on where the high water users are? That type of stuff that we would look at.
Do you think commercial is subsidizing our?
Generally, in water, by looking at the rate structure, that would be my initial assumption, because you're charging everyone the same, and single family puts the most burden on your system from a peaking standpoint, which is where your highest costs are. So that's usually the way it comes out.
Except there's such a high volume of water before there's a flat rate that I don't know, that's intuitively strikes me as not the case. But
What it would be is the single family as a class could be the case, but an individual customer, it'll all be different within the class, and that's why there'll be a big difference between everyone who's from 0 to 10 is going to have a different impact than everyone who's 10 and over, because you just eliminated the usage allowance. So it's going to impact people all over the place, essentially, is what it's going to be. So kind of the creative design of the rate structure needs to kind of mitigate that to an acceptable level, and that's where I would generally propose, if it's going to show significant impacts, you might identify where you would like the rate structure to go, and maybe we phase into that over the 5-year study period rather than immediately hitting customers with the change. So I'm kind of envisioning that we would bring forth some scenarios for you to look at with those kinds of impacts.
Makes sense.
I would guess on the sewer side, so if I can just touch the sewer side here, you've got single-family residential who's charged a flat rate. Multifamily residential is charged the same rate as the single-family for their first unit, and then a reduced per additional dwelling unit. And then your commercial customers are charged a flat rate per unit based on the type of business that they are. So all kinds of like fixture units, number of students, and really that kind of a structure is appropriate for an unmetered system where you don't have usage data to rely on. And so what we would propose is actually changing that and have it be actually based on their metered water usage data, since you have that available. And then also looking at a possibility between your commercial customers. You have commercial customers who probably contribute fairly domestic level strength, similar to a residential customer, and then you have some commercial customers that have pretty high strength that impact your wastewater system. And that's an equity issue that, again, needs to be balanced with simplicity. One of the things we might be suggesting is that we split that commercial class into 2 different classes for sewer, domestic strength and high strength, to capture that cost differential between the 2 of them. Again, when you do something like that, you have significant swings depending on what type of business you're currently talking about, whether they're high or low strength. Currently with our initial evaluation, there really isn't a direct connection between charging someone on their number of employees or number of bar stools or that kind of thing. So we might find, again, some significant changes within the class that might be phased in. And again, just by looking at the structure itself without analyzing the data, this would tell me that this would be the opposite of water, that for sewer, it's generally your residential and domestic commercial are probably subsidizing your high-strength commercial customers, since they're all being charged the same. So I'll kind of validate those findings and see what it comes out, and that may be something too where we need to phase into something like that. Okay, so finally, it's just this is just the initial discussion of the initial thoughts that I had on some potential rate structure changes based on previous discussions. If you have any other things that you would like us to make sure that we look at in the rate structures, we can do that. And then just looking at the schedule, we're looking for draft results in September, so it's a pretty tight time frame to get kind of pulled together, getting the draft analysis done by September, looking for bringing the proposed rates for potential action mid-October, and then trying to get everything finalized by the end of the year for implementation by January 1st. So I would suspect that, you know, we would be back here in early October.
So we would have an idea of what rates were going to be proposed in September?
We'll have the draft results reviewed with staff internally, probably the end of September. It would probably be the beginning of October, end of September. Again, it gives us a couple months, and certainly we're going to be working as quickly as we can to get those initial findings in and see what we can have. And we've got the 2 different parts. First, we need to look at what the revenue requirement analysis looks like. Does it fall in line with what you're looking at through 2015 and what that would be? And then bringing forth, now that we know what overall needs are for the water and sewer system, for example, if water needs a 5% increase for the next 5 years and sewer needs that, we would need that information then to use that to follow into the cost of service analysis. So it's kind of a 2-part analysis in having it done. So we'll do our best to get everything scheduled in advance to make sure that we can bring back on schedule.
We have tentatively set, or pretty much set, August 12th for your next visit for the second of the 3, and it's a strategically phased in discussion with the council. So there's information that will have been gleaned and can be shared, and that will be available on August 12th. That keeps us going. And then the next one was September 26th. Working with Karen's calendar because they're doing this for our colleagues as well in other places. So Mondays is often a council night. And then depending upon exactly where we were at with that, because it's a little bit in flux, then we look at the October meetings for what could happen. Hopefully, ultimately the utility budget is the utility budget, and this is how we charge the customers to receive the revenues. It's not changing the revenue. It's changing how we get the revenue. So it wouldn't have a huge impact on utility budgets in that regard. So this timing works for that. But we're pushing because it's important in the community for us to get this done. as quickly as possible. So we're pushing hard with Karen. We appreciate that.
And the other option, depending on the results, is the revenue requirement analysis will be finalized and show you what it would look like for the next, out through 2018. If it's something that it's looking like the results are having all kinds of shifts, you can always target to implement the cost of service changes in January 2015. I mean, you'd have that option if you came and the results really looked like you need a lot of public education and things before changing it. That's always an option for you to consider.
The purpose of this, at least in my mind, is to bring our utility rates down for our ratepayers, because right now it's untenable. So that's what I'm interested in finding, a way to bring these down for our city.
So, I mean, to be honest, where our baseline is starting with is your budget and your capital projects, and where we have the discretionary ability to do that is in some of the financial policies, like the system reinvestment funding. This study is not to look at changes to operational efficiencies and reducing your budgets, and so that might be something that, Trevor, if you want to add to.
Yeah, so there was a portion of the operation and maintenance feasibility report inside the public-private partnership as far as efficiency opportunities. And so some of those have been implemented, specifically the technology improvements. But the O&M side is not scoped specifically inside of the capital and financial and policy discussion, if you will.
I think Karen has mentioned that our low water using residential customers, of which I think the council has expressed significant concern, and we all share that concern. The rate structure that Karen has identified for us, and which I believe is becoming the industry best practice, will provide mitigation for them because there'll be a change in how we charge. That will be offset, that loss of revenue from that class of customer will be offset by more revenue from other classes of customers. Namely, I believe we're hearing, and we kind of anticipated this in our discussions, high water using residential customers, and then potentially in the multifamily and in the commercial classes, there'll be similar things that will happen. We will find that there are some commercial classes of users who have been subsidizing others. And so that's the equity that I believe we're looking for, is that our structure and how we charge has equity against the different types of customers that we have, and why they cost us what they cost us to deliver the water, whereas now it's sort of all averaged out and smoothed out, and so there isn't that equity. So when we push down on one spring, another one will pop up somewhere. However, the rationale for it will be clear based on the cost of providing that service. Depending upon how significant that shift is within a class, the advice we're receiving is phasing that part in. But I'm confident that absolutely one of the findings that we will have from this, and one of the recommendations that you will have, is that low water using residential customers will have the opportunity to see some savings. And then high using residential customers, which I am from time to time, will have incentive to conserve, but will also be paying our share for what it should be, and there'll be more equity with respect to that. And that's just the residential piece of it. The commercial side, we'll have to find out how that is.
And again, one of the things that I'll look at in commercial, because right now, everyone's charged the same, and so then within commercial, all commercial are charged the same. I'll look at your usage patterns and see, because you have a lot of small commercials, and then if there's a large commercial who uses water very differently, we might separate something into, for example, small commercial, large commercial. Depending, if we see something that warrants something like that differently, because some larger commercial customers, they may use a lot of water, but they'll use it on a very constant rate of use, which is a lot less expensive to your system than your customers who have peaking factors. And so on the commercial side, just because you use a lot of water doesn't mean that you're the highest cost on the system. And so from commercial, we look at, is it warranted to separate? Kind of like on the sewer side, domestic, commercial versus high. Strength on the water side, it might be, a small water
Doesn't the
user
water rate
versus a
have
large.
an impact on the sewer rate? Because isn't it just a factor of the sewer, of the
No,
water
we would-
rate, I mean?
No, we would be designing sewer rates standalone to cover sewers
You
costs.
can't meter, it's hard to meter.
You
sewer.
base it on water usage.
That's
So
what I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
so what you do,
Percentages of it.
so for residential, when you're designing the cost of service, even though they're a flat rate, for residential, we would look at winter period water usage. That most closely serves as the surrogate for sewer contribution, since all the outside watering doesn't go into the sewer system. For multifamily and commercial, generally their water usage is used as the surrogate for sewer contribution, given that a lot of their water, most of their water goes into the sewer system. And again, we can tell those patterns by looking at your usage over the months. And so they would be equitably assigned based on trying to eliminate that water usage that doesn't go into the system, but their rate would then be applied to their actual water usage. So if you conserve in water, you will have a lower sewer bill. Generally, we don't find that you get a whole lot of conservation on your sewer side.
Joyce?
In the commercial class, a beauty salon would use more water than like an auto parts supply. Do you break down the commercial?
Yeah, it'll be based on everyone's individual water usage. So currently, your charge structure doesn't base it on actual water usage. It just has number of stools, number of buildings, number of students, things like that really don't measure accurately what the true water usage. So the proposal is to change that to each individual customer their bill would be based on their own water usage first. So example, if you're using your two examples, beauty salon, they're going to have the same rate. Let's just say it's $2 per 1,000 gallons. They'll have the same rate, but their bills will be different because it'll apply to different volumes of water.
And in terms of expense efficiencies and trying to mitigate the overall cost of providing the same level of service that we're currently providing, and then meeting the mandates that we're under in terms of system improvements and system enhancements, there are still a couple of opportunities that Karen identified in our financial policies where she will try to find the sweet spot for us so that we stay compliant with our underwriting obligations and provide us choices around pushing out getting that system reinvestment to where it should be, potentially doubling, but probably not doubling the length of time that we are phasing that in. All of that can help make the pie smaller over the period of time. So there will be some of those opportunities, but fundamental opportunities to reduce our O&M costs at the utility when we have recommendations and analysis that have pointed to the fact that we actually will need to be adding staff as we grow and expand the operation of the plant. We're adding additional capacity in the plant, and we're doing additional things there. What Trevor is working on right now is the adoption of some new technologies. He talked about this a little bit in his department update about a month ago, was that? There's some real promise potentially in some additional technologies that we could invest in for some one-time dollars, and then smaller ongoing operations where when the enhancements at the plant come online, we need 2 additional employees, maybe we won't, because the efficiencies we gain from the technology will free up our existing resources to be able to do that. So those are the things that Trevor's working hard on in terms of the O&M. and we're looking forward to what he'll be able to do for us there. And then we will eke out everything that we can in these financial policies, working with Karen as our expert advisor to make sure that we are prudent and stay tight with respect to our underwriting responsibilities, but eke out as much savings as we possibly can with respect to the cost of the system so that we can pass that on, and then present a more equitable rate system to you where folks are paying the real cost for their impacts on the system. And then just once again, I'll emphasize that you can expect to see opportunity for the low water using residential customer to see some relief on the water side. So that's everything that's tied up into all of this, and depending upon how that all works and what those impacts are, we have to be sensitive to the different customer classes, particularly if there's the equity shows maybe you've been subsidized in the past and that subsidy is going to end. How quickly would that happen? We don't know who that will be, but we'll have to work with those folks, and I think Karen's advice about phasing in that regard is good advice.
And likely because water and sewer could act even contrary. There may be a different subsidy in one than the other. I'll bring forward for your residential customers the combined bill impact, because it could be that they're getting rate relief in water. You know, I'll bring both so you can see what their total bill for water and sewer will be for the customer classes, to give you a full picture of what that impact would be to the individual customer. And then if there are any particular large commercial customers that you particularly want me to run bills for, I can do that as well.
Couple of things. In terms of subsidies, one of my ongoing concerns is that the system development charges, which is what we charge new developments and new uses, must be large enough that the existing customer base is not subsidizing new development. That's a very important policy direction as far as I'm concerned. And along with that, they actually should also be making a significant capital contribution to the existing system that they're plugging into. Now, whether we're allowed to do that under the law, I'm not entirely sure. But we have built a system here that has excess capacity. It cost us money to build that capacity. New users who are going to use that capacity should pay for it.
So that's the approach, kind of what the approach that we would use for the system development charges is you look at both recovering historical costs plus your planned upgrades and expansions in the charge. So again, there are different approaches to system development charges, again, depending on your goals. And so the most equitable ways that you're capturing both. Your existing customers have been, let's just say, carrying the cost of your excess capacity in your existing system. So that piece will be recovered in the system development charge in addition to the future.
It's especially crucial because if we're looking at a 10-year plan, it's now true that we can hold SDCs for 10 years. We used to be, we could only hold them for 6. So you were building capacity 10 years out, but you could only charge 6 years out, and that was inherently inequitable.
Okay, so that's impact fees, which are different. You don't have the rule on this.
Oh, I thought they changed the rule on this.
Not for water and sewer.
SDCs are
Okay.
right in there.
Are they still 6 years?
There is no limit.
There is no.
Oh, there is no
There
limit.
never has been.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Then
the challenge is the timing, right? You need the capital projects now, and say it's going to be, $1 million for this capital project. You aren't going to collect $1 million in SDCs in time to build it. So you set your charge to recover that cost, but you're going to get the revenue over several years out, and you need the revenue now. That's the issue with SDCs. It's always a timing issue. But there isn't the things like the latecomer agreements or things where you have a statutory limit of time.
And then the other thing is, especially when you get into large commercial users, flow is not really as much of an issue as biological oxygen demand and particulates. And then you have issues as to averages and peaking. So for several of our very large commercial users, in some cases, flow is actually a contribution to the operation of the system. Biological oxygen demand almost never is, and certainly particulates aren't. So especially for the larger commercial classes, I would at least like to see a discussion of a fairly complicated rate structure that looks not only at flow, but also at BOD and particulates.
So what I would recommend on that discussion, for water, doing it on meter size is the most common and captures
Right.
by the meter size, the capacity that goes in there. What we can look at for on the sewer side is generally they are done on flow. I would say it's the most common, an equivalent residential flow. So a single family pays $3,000 and it's based on 300 gallons per minute per day. And then a commercial customer would convert that into EDUs, take their estimated
Right.
sewer contribution divided by that, you'd pay on that. We could do something like, that applies for users up to, an X size. And then you can develop unit costs for your larger, just on the sewer side, you can do something like that where they're charged X dollars for flow, X dollars per BOD, and X dollars for suspended solids, and that would capture that.
Because, for example, there's a Sapphire plant over there that takes drinking water and uses as cooling water. It is never used as processed water at all. It flows through stainless steel pipes and then goes into wastewater. That has no biological oxygen demand and no suspended solids. They should be charged a different rate than somebody who's adding a lot of biological demand.
The high BOD is usually like food processing and things like that, isn't it?
Right.
Mhm.
Or in our case, we would certainly worry about Pendleton.
We have in our existing rate structure, depending on, I can't remember, Trevor will have to remind me when it is triggered, because I don't think it's triggered automatically, but there are certain classes of industrial user primarily, and we're lumping that into commercial, but yes, the industrial user, we currently charge in that way.
Okay.
And it's a multivariate formula that's a function of TSS, which is something.
Total
suspended.
Total suspended solids, BOD, which we've talked about, and flow. And in fact, up until not very long ago, the Pendleton Woolen Mill had its own unique section in our code about how that would be handled, and now they are treated like all of the other industrial customers. So as we move forward in dealing with that, any transition from our current to a proposed rate structure, we'll have to decide how to continue to use what we currently have and adjust that for those types of users.
And then the third question is, if we push out capital developments, and this is maybe for Trevor or you, or maybe even for Mitch, do we need to modify our capital facilities plan? If we modify the capital facilities plan, do we need to modify the comp plan? What are the timelines on doing those kinds of things?
It depends on the significance of the change. Some of the things that we've done have not necessitated a change to the overall comp plan. But we are definitely looking at changes to the CIP, the short-term CIP, and the water system plan. Absolutely. So we can't do those every week. I think we can do those annually. Right.
First of all, thanks very much for enlightening us in what is obviously a very detailed area. Secondly, I understand the concern that's being raised about new users paying for our excess capacity that's already been developed. On the assumption that that excess capacity was developed using debt service, are they not already paying?
There is an adjustment in the calculation where you would subtract, so you take that excess capacity, the existing charge basis, and you get a dollar amount, then you deduct from that your outstanding debt principal to eliminate that double pay.
Okay, and that's my concern.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know, one thing I forgot to mention to Karen in our phone conversation as we prepared for this, one of the things that the council expressed that was important to you is working to have the utility taxes itemized on the bill as opposed to just captured in the overall rate, so that a customer can look at our bill like they do some of the franchised utilities where they itemize that out. And that's an expectation that the council has placed on us in terms of this, so
Okay.
figure out a way to do that.
Okay.
Call Vancouver up. I had the conversation with the city finance people, and they said they could figure out how to do it.
Yeah, I can figure, yeah, we do it commonly for both. They're two different approaches, and so maybe I can kind of give the pluses and the minuses and the comments that you know, I've heard on that. One way is to embed the utility tax in your utility rates, which is your current practice. The other way is to add them on top, and it's just a simple matter of you don't include the costs in your expenses and you add it on top. The disadvantage, I would say, from what I've heard, the comments being on pulling it out and doing it separately, is it implies that the utility tax is a tax on your customer, and it isn't. It's a tax on the water utility, no different than any other expense of the water utility. It's not a tax. And so it gets perceived by your customers as a tax on them, and that's a negative perception. And the utility tax from the general fund is nothing other than an expense of the water utility, just like all
Well,
other expenses. So that's
Legally,
the other side.
That's correct. But
Right.
As a practical matter, it's passed straight to the customer, so
Right.
effectively, it would just be, you know, I don't know if I'd even set forth the rate, but saying, identifying the bill, how much of this is the utilities tax? Not your tax, but the utilities tax.
We could label it accordingly.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, so that's definitely something we can incorporate. Do you want to see it both ways, or do you want that just to be the direction to have it?
What, you know
on
what
top
other
of the
cities
bill?
do? The other cities?
It's predominantly embedded, but many do it on top. So either way, so I would say, you know, both are within a common practice, but mostly embedded. And again, it's not a problem at all to display it that way.
Just an ongoing education item.
I think that's the direction.
So that's the
that we've
preference, so
received,
we'll just take
is
it out, okay.
To show it separately.
Correct.
Right.
Okay,
And that utility tax is separate than the charge to the utility for using the services of the finance department and purchasing, or
Correct.
Those are indirect costs now.
Yeah.
Those are indirects, that's
Don't have anything to do
different.
with anything else.
so that tax is separate from the indirect costs.
Right.
okay, that's good to know, because that's a good thing to take out at the beginning rather than to incorporate later.
Sorry to drop that on you.
Oh, that's okay.
I meant to mention that.
No
at our
problem,
phone call.
we can certainly do that.
I'm assuming this is not the place to bring up monthly billing.
Unless there's other questions on the, what you might expect in this process, this is the only item that we had for the agenda for the workshop. So I think anything related to what we're doing.
There are impacts on different rate structure alternatives and how effective they are, depending on your frequency of billing.
Explain that to me.
So if you have a conservation rate like what we're proposing, where you pay more when you use more water, the folks that use more water in the summer are paying more for that. And when you have bi-monthly billing, there's a lag, and they don't see that bill until the summer season's almost over, so there isn't as much ability to react and control their bill as if you had monthly reading. So there's the pros and cons. Of course, monthly billing is more expensive. Monthly billing provides more timely information for customers to react, but it has the opposite cost effect. But those are some of the considerations in rate design, is what's your frequency of billing. For example, if you had, not too many metered systems have this, but there are some flat systems that are transitioning to metering that only bill twice a year, and they want a conservation rate structure. Not very practical in being effective, but monthly and bi-monthly from this rate design are both common, but that's just a piece of information.
I certainly would like to see an estimate of how much more it would cost to do monthly billing instead of bi-monthly billing.
Well,
That would not be me. Yeah, I don't think I would have that.
Well, there's two ways you can do it. One, you could just still do the meter reading every other month.
Yes.
And divide by 2. Then your only other cost is printing and postage. Handling checks and things like that, but that's the second way of doing it.
We hope to mitigate sort of that office handling of bills as we introduce more and more technology, try to get more and more of our customers into automatic e-billing and e-payments as a choice, a customer choice, not a requirement. But
Those costs associated to that, the expenses aren't something that Karen would be looking at. That's something that
Right.
we do through finance. Although the cost for doing that would need to get
It would
built
be-
into what Karen is doing.
Right. Just for information, is the thinking on going to monthly to get smaller bills to the customers?
That was part of it, and the other part was it also would give us an envelope to put information
For
about the
staffers.
city and, from the city to our customers, to our city.
Well, if someone's getting $1,200 a month for live on Social Security, and one month of that time period, 15, it's, your utility bill's 15% of your monthly income, and the next month it's 0%.
I agree.
That's a big difference. I guess you don't eat in a month, your utility bill is.
Yeah, it's a problem for the
plan.
Yeah. For people, there are a lot of people who a $200 bill every other month is much more of a problem than $100 every month.
what's your experience, Karen, with customers anecdotally, bi-monthly, monthly?
There's been, there's a lot of comments for the reason about it being hard. I'm not familiar with very many who have made that change for that fix. Bi-monthly billing generally is considered the balance because the cost offset of doing the monthly billing goes up high. I see the issue, and it certainly is a worse issue the higher your bill goes. The more rates keep going up and the more that bi-monthly bill keeps getting bigger. It's a harder hit. I can't think of a lot of utilities that I can think of in the last several years who have changed from bi-monthly to monthly. And it's usually the cost impact.
Well, our electric bill and our gas bills are all monthly
Right.
bills. And so at least in our community, the only bill that we get bi-monthly is our utility bill.
And waste
And
connection.
waste.
Oh,
is-
waste
that's
connection.
every 3 months, yeah.
2 months.
It's bi-monthly.
These are-
Right.
But it's $30.
It's not as much as,
Yeah.
unless you're getting extra services.
Yeah, especially in the summer months, your two bi-monthly summer bills can be large.
Do you see, I know that some of the energy utilities offer, and I don't know what it's called in the industry, where there's an estimate of what you're
Averaging?
averaging. And I don't know if that's common practice.
Not in water and wastewater, no. It comes up in discussion for that same thing, averaging, but no, it's not common. It kind of turns you kind of into a flat rate a little bit.
Right.
Is there a reason, Karen, that it's not common?
I think just that, you know, it's just, you base it on your metered usage of that month or that by month, and when you average it out, I don't know if it's administrative burden on people or readjusting it. It's just not. It has just never been a particularly popular rate concept for water or sewer.
The reason I ask is that you've certainly got CPU and Northwest Natural that do that go through the same cyclical kinds of things that we do with water and sewer as well.
Yeah, there is no. I mean, I can't think of anything inherently that says that wouldn't make sense to do that, because, you know, one of the areas of having it going monthly is you're collecting the majority of your revenue in your summer season, so you've got to be prepared to carry your costs in the earlier months. So from a utilities perspective, it would provide more revenue stability to average it.
And would those reserves have to change in order to, those 90-day reserves?
You would
you're
not
talking
need
about?
you would not likely need as high of reserves, because the purpose of the reserves are to balance with those timing issues, that you have your fixed costs and all your O&M and things that you have to pay monthly,
Right.
but you don't get your revenues in that same flow. So that's the rationale. That's the one rationale for the reserves, are those known differences, and then the other rationale are for the unexpected differences, like wet summers and things like that. So, from a utility standpoint, I can see that, you know, getting the known revenue monthly would make sense. But
There's some potential impacts as far as water use efficiency rule handed down from the feds and through the state on a monthly basis. Our production weighed up against our actual consumption. So our master meters off of our wellheads compared to what's delivered, what's actually consumed and confirmed at the meter.
so you'd
there's-
have to explain that.
Yeah, so there's parameters where we need to be able to capture exactly how much water we're losing within our system, how tight our distribution system is in our storage tanks.
But you wouldn't be able to evaluate your system loss until the end of the year.
Wouldn't be able to do it on a month-to-month
Yeah.
basis. We just happen upon maybe a large, you know,
And
single-family leak or something if it was vacated or snowbirding or whatever it may be. So that's one piece of,
there's also the loss of the economic signaling for conservation.
Right. That's probably the biggest reason of why it's not implemented, is it is slightly contrary to the idea of the high water users in the summer months pay more. When you average that out, it just kind of all loses its focus. Yeah, I am unaware of any utility that does it. That doesn't mean that there aren't any out there, but I'm not aware of any in Washington.
they do it quite a bit in the Midwest and the East where there's 4 feet of snow over the meter
Yeah.
boxes without.
Yeah, they do, yeah, yes.
Or
they
it's
do.
in the basement of the house so it doesn't freeze and it doesn't get red for 4 months.
Yeah,
But-
they do a
so
lot
it
of
does.
2 reads a year.
I just wonder if there isn't some way for you to be able to balance that out, do it on an electronic, build in some other incentives in there that create them electronic payments if you've got monthlies and makes it more stable for the resident as well, or the ratepayer. But then you'd have to factor in truing it up at the end of the year as well.
Yeah, I mean, from a designing the rate, that wouldn't have an impact, so I would look at, I mean, that would be, I would think, a policy thing that you could look at outside of it. I don't think that I would design a rate differently if you have that. It's just your projections during monthly. Overall, you should be the same. Over the 12 months, it should be the same, so I think that's certainly that wouldn't have to be answered to get
Right.
some alternatives to you.
The city gets a little float if the money comes in a month early. earlier too on a monthly billing. Just occurred to me.
Other questions for Karen? Other questions on the study, other questions or thoughts on them moving forward and the work that they're doing? Okay,
Okay, so we.
Karen, thank you very much.
Direction we have was to start going forward with?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
We'll see you in another month or so.
August 12th.
Okay, we're at that opportunity again in the agenda if anyone from the public would like to address council. Tom?
I mentioned it before, and it just kind of came up a little earlier. All of my bills except water sewer are electronic. I pick up the phone, I punch a few keys, and it's over. I don't know if the city can do that. I don't know whether there's a problem with that. But if the city can do it, I would certainly love it, and it would probably save the city a bunch of cash, because you wouldn't have to mess with the bill. I wouldn't even care if you sent me one, because the phone will tell me how much the bill is. Do you want to pay it now? Yes. Do you want to pay all of it? Yes. Do you use a credit card? Yes. That's it. Done. And nobody even touches the money. But I don't know if the city can do that.
I think that's one of the questions we want to look at.
We have an automatic billing option. Right now, I use it, where it comes out automatically on your check, but it's not
I
point of
want to be
sale.
able to pay it when I want to pay it sometime during the month. I want to pick up a phone and dial an 800 number. It'll say, billing for the city of Washougal water and sewer, you owe $105.33. Do you wish to pay now? And then I push a few keys and it does. I don't want to leave you a check and have you take it out at a specific time, because periodically, some months, I can't pay it till the end.
Right, I think we have that module available to us. We have not implemented that capability, but those are the things that we're looking at, and as I was mentioning.
That would really be great. I would really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Anyone else from the public that would like to address council? Barbara?
Do I understand from what the lady was talking about, that if you go to a different rate structure, that, or a different kind of whatever, that there won't be flat minimums for bills? Or did I misunderstand that?
There will no longer be a block of water that's part of your bill, but there will be a minimum charge, but it won't include usage. And then, and I would assume that number is going to be lower than the current number because it is including some usage. And then you would be billed for usage on top of that. So I think the answer to what she's asking is yes, but there is still a base charge. It's not zero.
But you'll pay for, you would say, just for example, you would have let's say a $59, it wouldn't be, but let's say a $59 minimum charge that you're always gonna be charged. But whatever water that you use is gonna be besides that.
Correct.
It's not included?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You bet. Any other comments, questions? I have nothing for you at this point. Anything from council? Okay, in that case, we are adjourned until 7 o'clock, 30 minutes from now for our regular meeting.